Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for our next fireside chat here at the FreightWaves 3PL Summit. I'm Kaylee Nix, and we're here with Matt Silver from Cargado. And Matt, it's crazy times that we're living in right now, especially if you are in the world of logistics. We're right at the end of February. This month started with, are there tariffs? Are there not tariffs? We're right at that 30-day mark right now where tariffs on Mexico and Canada could go into effect or not. The tariffs on China have now been in effect for about a month's worth, and the logistics industry is still just trying to figure out what the heck is going on. So here to talk a little bit about the cross-border situation. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the 3PL Summit.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
So today we're talking a lot about the uncertainty aspect, and I think we're going to kind of wrap it all into what cross-border trade looks like specifically with that 3PL lens. Give us kind of your high-level overview right now as we sit towards the end of February. We're right at the end of our Lunar New Year kind of break in the freight markets that we see, and we're sitting in this space where it's like, are we still in a freight recession? Do we really know how much tariffs are going to impact us? From 300,000 feet or 30,000 feet, talk to us about what you're seeing.
So obviously things with trade for North America right now are having quite the moment in terms of the level of uncertainty we have. So I think there's two scenarios that are going to play out. Either we're going to see these tariffs eventually come into effect, or we're going to see the USMCA get renegotiated. And if tariffs go into effect, then the big impact is going to be initially on these companies that are importing goods from Mexico, Canada, from China. They're going to turn around and pass that price along, or that price increase along, to the consumer. But the other place that they can apply pressure to be able to reduce their cost, to be able to absorb that 25% price increase, is to their supplier base. And so their suppliers could be the companies that they're buying their materials from to be able to manufacture what they're shipping, or it could be their transportation providers. And so they very well may turn to logistics providers, freight forwarders, 3PLs, freight brokerages to ask for support on capacity and to try to negotiate prices down and try to basically push their suppliers to get more efficient with pricing. And so I think we'll see pressure on logistics companies to try to get more efficient with their rates, which is code for lowering their price. A lot of talk about broker transparency and margins and all that stuff, but they'll be pushed on to get more competitive on their pricing, and then that push will then continue on to the carriers ultimately. And so if those tariffs go into effect, we're going to see that. I think no matter what, manufacturers are going to be thinking more heavily about their freight spend when it comes to cross-border freight or imports of any kind. And so we're going to see that. I think we'll see that no matter what, some sort of pressure on pricing and capacity. If the tariffs do not go into effect, then what we'll see is the USMCA will get renegotiated. It's scheduled to be done in 2026. It could end up getting done before that. And I imagine that'll result in a shift towards the materials or the goods that are traded between the US, Mexico, and Canada, with an attempt to see the trade deficit narrow between the US and those two countries. And so we could see more freight flowing south to Mexico and more freight going into Canada if trade starts to balance out a little bit more between the US and those two countries.
It's interesting that you bring that up because consistently Mexico and Canada have been the United States' top trade partners for I think now going on almost 2 full years, right? Mexico's been number one. Canada's been kind of floating between 2 and 3, flip-flopping with China pretty often. But it shows that there is a lot of value, and there continues to be a lot of value in this cross-border trade, specifically across the southern border into Mexico. We know that it's been really lucrative for the 3PL space. We've seen a ton of companies move headquarters down to the Rio Grande Valley or close down into South and Central Texas, down across Arizona and into Southern California. How do these companies, as they're continuing to look forward to maybe their strategy into 2025, 2026, do they stick with what they're doing? Is it too soon to make a decision to say, hey, we're kind of bowing out of all of the plans that we've made? Or are they just kind of moving forward with some caution?
I think they're going to continue doing it because keep in mind, there are new businesses, new manufacturers that have announced plans to expand into Mexico. Whether that keeps at the same pace or not, we'll see. But a lot of companies have been in Mexico for decades. A lot of manufacturers are down there. continue to ship a lot of freight. You're not going to see, just because of tariffs or the threat of tariffs, you're not going to just see a manufacturer pick up, from where they're manufacturing and move overnight. They can't. And so they've already got their supply chains built around dependencies on Mexico. The time zones are still really valuable, the similarities in times, the proximity from a travel perspective, the language and culture aspect, where there's a lot more people in the United States that speak Spanish and understand the blend between American and Mexican culture. And so I don't see a reason why shippers would move away from there. And so if shippers are not moving away, then logistics providers, 3PLs are not going to move away from that either. They'll continue to support those shippers that are moving freight cross-border. We'll see what happens over the next 3-6 months as trade starts to shift a little bit.
The nearshoring initiative has brought a ton of freight down into Mexico. We've seen so many companies decide to relocate, even their full supply chains down into Mexico because of that easy access and the proliferation of cross-border freight. Is that a trend that we continue to see continue on its steady path, or do we maybe even see an uptick, knowing that the tariffs from China are in place and it's not looking like a trade war with China is unavoidable? But as you mentioned, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement is on the table for renegotiation, and hopefully we'll see the trade war not accelerate down to the southern border.
Yeah, I think if you look at the president's cabinet and the people that he surrounded himself with, it's a lot more heavily around people that are considered, China hawks, and that they don't want to work with China. And there is a lot more collaboration opportunity between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And so I do think that trend will continue towards people moving more towards Mexico. I think, if there's constantly a threat of tariffs hanging over the three countries, then that's going to scare people. But I don't think that's going to constantly be a threat. I don't think we're going to see that spark up the way that we did previously, and we saw this happen in Trump's first administration as well. And so I don't think it's going to continue. And I do think that people will continue to invest in manufacturing in Mexico and continuing to relocate their manufacturing down there.
So, of course, the role of Cargado is to help facilitate the ease that comes with finding cross-border freight and moving those cross-border loads. Talk to me a little bit about the infrastructure differences, because that's a point of contention that I feel like a lot of people maybe scares them away from getting into the cross-border aspect, right? Is figuring out, how do I set this up? How do I work with maybe Mexican carriers or suppliers to make sure that they fit these customs regulations that we need in the United States? Talk to me a little bit about how that exists now, and if the way that you're doing things infrastructure-wise could possibly be under threat with changing regulation.
Yeah, so the way that freight moves between Mexico and the United States is that there's usually one trucking company that might get hired for the entire door-to-door shipment, but it's not typically the same driver or the same tractor that moves that load. And when it gets to the border, it hands off from, a Mexican partner carrier that's hauling that trailer with the freight inside of it to the border. They hand it off to a transfer driver or to a B1 driver, and then that driver goes across the border and they'll go deliver the load. And so there's already a relay that happens just with the trailer and the freight inside of the trailer. In other cases, it actually gets cross-docked in Laredo at a warehouse or in El Paso or whichever border city it's crossing. There's also a border city involved. There's a Mexican customs broker and a U.S. customs broker. There's two languages, two cultures, an actual border. And so there are a lot of different complexities that are involved in cross-border freight that make it, something that's not just an expansion of the United States. And if you think about, most freight brokerages, most logistics companies start off with domestic freight as their business model that they're moving. They'll typically expand into Canada with ease because, for the most part, people in Canada speak the same language as in the United States. And when it comes to Mexico, there's a fear there. And I had that same fear when I started getting into it at Coyote originally. And so it's the language piece, it's the cultural piece, it's the fear of freight getting stolen potentially. But I think it's a little bit overthought in terms of people being afraid of it. And we're hoping that people feel a little bit more comfortable going into it by using our product.
I love that answer. And it is almost intimidating because it takes a lot to get down there and get good at it. And one of the things that you've got to be willing to do is be transparent. And I want to touch on the broker transparency aspect a little bit with regards to cross-border freight. You didn't think that we could get out of here today without talking about that just a little bit, right? Talk to me a little bit about the broker transparency argument and where it falls into the space if we're talking about cross-border freight, particularly freight that is pretty lucrative sometimes.
So I don't have. I admittedly don't know the deep details about what the actual argument is beyond the fact that there's a couple people that post about it on a regular basis. I wanted to get a sense for why people are arguing about it. It turned into a whole thing in the comments. But my belief is, first of all, I don't think in any other industry you just go require somebody to share the business model or their margin profile of how their business operates. I can also tell you as a freight brokerage, that somebody that ran a freight brokerage with Forager, we had months where we had negative margin. And this is not how you should be building a freight brokerage. I learned a lot of lessons from doing that, but we literally lost money on freight. And it was part of something that I learned when I was at Coyote about the commitment to never give freight back and to not go back on the rates that we had with our customers. And so we did that. And I had no problem telling carriers that we were losing money on freight. I had no problem telling carriers about that, when I was losing money as a carrier rep before that. And so I think most of the time there's this disillusion that freight brokers are making tons of money. And somebody put a comment in that post about driving around in Land Rovers and all this stuff. And most freight brokerages are not printing cash. If freight brokerages printed cash and you were just able to apply tech to it, then you'd see these digital freight brokerages actually turn out to be something exceptionally valuable. And instead, you saw what happened with Convoy, you saw what happened with Forager. We did not turn out to be this big, massive business. And so I think that illusion is people need to be a little bit more understanding of the fact that it's not crazy margins. There is freight that can have good margin, but if somebody's making a ton of money on a hazmat load or on something overdimensional, I have to imagine the carrier that's hauling that freight is making a ton of money. They're happy with the rate that they're getting and they don't care that the broker's making money. So I don't think it's a thing. I think to me, the biggest thing about transparency in this industry needs to just be brokers and carriers working more collaboratively together and not fighting over these things, not double brokering freight, not co-brokering, whatever you want to call the brokering piece of that besides a traditional freight broker and carrier working together. I think that's where the focus needs to be.
Right. The post-COVID freight boom hyped meme of the brokers rolling in cash, it's outdated. It's not realistic, right?
I mean, that might have been, I'm sure that is the case. It was not for us. Forager we had mostly automotive and industrial freight. And so when the pandemic happened, crash, our volume died. You hear about some of the brokers that move a lot of grocery and a lot of food and bev, they definitely saw a boom happen during the pandemic, and I'm sure they benefited from it. And the freight curves, you've seen these curves from different companies, the margins go up and down, and brokers take on that risk. They take on that responsibility of potentially losing money on freight. And so there's some freight they'd make a lot of money on, but they're probably also bailing out their customers in the middle of the pandemic that couldn't afford to pay those surges. And so I'm sure there's a balance, but I don't think it was not real. I think it was real during the pandemic, but I don't think that's a consistent thing.
Well, I love the take, and I love hearing people then bring us back to reality of what it's like in the 3PL space. Matt, thank you so much for joining us for our 3PL Summit. For folks who want to connect with you, of course, you have a fabulous LinkedIn presence. Where else can they go to do that, or maybe find more about Cargado?
Either cargado.com, follow me on X, LinkedIn. I've got a newsletter as well, but you can find all that stuff on the internet.
There we go. The internet's a beautiful place. Thank you guys for joining us from Cargado, Matt Silver once again. And thank you all for sticking with us for the 3PL Summit. Stay tuned. We got plenty more chats coming up after this, and we'll be back in just a few minutes.